for the order of things are that last week we read about the construction of the tabernacle. Now, we did not read about the actual construction, but rather information was given to Moshe how to eventually build it. In next week's Parashah, we're going to read about the sin of the golden calf that occurs as Moshe makes his way back from the top of the mountain with the luchot, with the tablets. In this week's portion, what we have, the bulk of the parasha is a detailed description of the Kohanim and their vestments, the unique vestments of the high priest, of the Kohen Gadol, the garments of the Kohen Ediot, the average priest. And then in the second half of the parasha, we have details about the ceremony for day one and the days leading to day one of the tabernacle, meaning day one of the construction of the tabernacle, which occurred on the first day of Nisan, is a very significant day, and therefore there was a very unique ceremony for that day, and it's described in detail in this week's parasha. Now, the first three, it's actually two verses of this week's parasha seem to be out of place, and that's what we're going to try to understand. Number one, we're going to read those two verses. We're going to ask a very basic question. Thank you. Now we're ready. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Amen.
So what are the first two verses of this week's Parsha? Ve'ata, now you. Who's the you? Who's the you? You, Moshe. Moshe. Tetzaveh b'nei Israel. You're going to go ahead and you're going to command in the future. Not yet, at the right time, because there's no structure yet. But at some point in the future, you're going to command b'nei Israel. Ve'yikhu, and they shall take. Listen, look at the following word. Elecha, for you. Oh, for me. Right? What's going to be? You know, a good cup of coffee. What's it going to be? Nope. Shemen zait zach katit. You should go ahead and take. They're going to take for you pure pressed olive oil. For you. For you. So what is it going to be? For a good salad? Right? What do you sprinkle on it? On hummus? You've been to Israel, they give you hummus with this big thick layer of olive oil on top. I mean, if it's for you, if it's elecha, that's what we expect. Nope. Lamaor, for illumination. Okay, where? Lehalot ner tamid, it's to kindle the lamp, and it's going to be continual. Where is it done? If it's for Moshe, where is it done? Right? In his home, in his office? No, verse 21. Be'ohel moed, in the tent of meeting. Michutz la parochat, outside of the partition, near, which is near the edut, and who is going to be the one to arrange it daily? Your brother Aharon. So what are the difficulties here? Difficulty number one. Why is the mentioning of this future service placed here when we don't even know what the Kohanim are wearing yet? This is like not, should not be placed here. It's important information, but this should be placed later on, Parshat Bahalotcha maybe. Like right now, all we have is that Moshe Rabbeinu was told that eventually they'll construct a tabernacle. We're going to be learning in this week's portion that there are special clothes for those priests who are going to be performing the service in the tabernacle. But why mention the fact that eventually you know that they're going to go ahead and kindle. They're going to kindle these lights. Number two, what is this elecha? Elecha, meaning for you. It ain't for him. We don't find it by lechem apanim. We don't find it by when other services are described. We don't find this idea of elecha, that it is for you. So there's clarity that is needed there as well. And next, who's not mentioned here at all, and not mentioned in these two verses? You would expect by Daber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Moshe is not mentioned here, and this is a very unique parsha, because from the birth of Moshe, throughout Torah, besides Devarim, which is Moshe speaking, but from the birth of Moshe until the end of the book of Bamidbar, Moshe Rabbeinu's name appears in every single parsha, and this week's parsha is well known. His name does not appear. Must be a reason for it. So those are questions you're going to keep in mind. But then we're going to go ahead and start a few verses into the next section, and then we're going to hopefully try to the best of our ability to clarify what the main message of this parsha is about. Now the light that we're talking about is the menorah. There are unique dimensions for the menorah. We read them last week's portion. This menorah ideally should be from gold. It's not a must, by the way. And although they teach all children, and in the coloring books of Hanukkah, they have the Maccabees coming in to the Bet HaMikdash and lighting the golden menorah, it's not true. There was no golden menorah. It was gone. They had to make a makeshift, a temporary menorah out of wood, right, for the event, because the Greeks took everything. So it should be gold. But post facto could be other metals. As you know, in Yerushalayim, you've been to the Kotel, you've walked down. Walking up is the challenge, but you've walked down from the Rova to the Kotel, and you have seen the menorah there. This was a menorah that 10 years ago used to be in the Cardo, right? Now it's closer because it's facing the Temple Mount, and you know very well the ones who made it where they really want it, right? They want it on the Temple Mount itself. It's a fascinating, it's gold-plated, by the way. It's gold-plated. If it would be all gold, I don't know how they would afford it, but it's gold-plated. Nevertheless, an expensive item. I hope the security is good there. There's some magnificent things you could learn from just looking at it. Because, you know, the Torah tells us in last week's portion that there's supposed to be meshukadim, right, which Rashi translates as that there should be designs on it, but others translate it as that there should be designs like almonds, and actually if you look, you'll see the designs like almonds on it. So it's something to observe, it's something to study. The base is not a copy of the base that you'll find in Rome. You've been to Rome? On the gate of Titus, because that's not a very Jewish base. If you look at the base, it has like serpents and other creatures, which some believe that it can't be that it was in the Bet HaMikdash. You know, it's so Goyish, it's so un-Jewish. I think that it probably was there, but you know, there were a lot of forces controlling the temple the last few decades, or perhaps even longer during the Second Temple period. So the light we are talking about that we read in these two portions, the image you should have before we read on, image is the menorah. Okay, it's the symbol actually of the state of Israel. You've been by the Knesset too. There is one, I still remember. And have that image in mind. And now we are ready to start the real section and the bulk of the Parsha. Where in verse 28 we are told, Ve'ata. Now again, you, Hakrev elecha, right? Go ahead and bring near to yourself Aharon et Aaron Achicha and his children. And the beginning of their journey of priesthood will start with garments. Verse 2, now let's look in the next two verses why and what's the purpose of these unique vestments. What's the purpose of them? They look cool, there's no question about it. Purim, one of our kids, it was Uzi, as when he was a 7-year-old, he got dressed as a Kohen Gadol, right? It's one of those popular items that they're sold in Geula there that you could buy, like for 20 shekel, like Kohen Gadol. So obviously these are impressive garments, but we'll try to analyze the reason for them. So we are told, verse 2, verse bet, Ve'asita bigdei kodesh le'aharon achicha. You shall make these vestments of sanctity for your brother Aharon. For what purpose? Tune in. Lechavod uletifaret. Glory, splendor. They're impressive. They impress people, right? A person, we all know that you feel different when you put on, right, your fancy garment, your Armani suit. They say that even among, in the BBC, I remember hearing it, I don't know if it's true, but that even the announcers on the radio, they come into work with a three-piece suit. True? No.
They went to bed in 3 piece.
That's it. In Leeds, probably not, but in other places, there's from the coal mines or who knows what. Anyway, so kavod vetifaret. There's a kavod. You look in the mirror, you feel good. You straighten your tie. You feel that you are a person of splendor. There's glory there. So, if I would ask you after reading verse 2. What was the purpose of these cool vestments? You would give me 2 words, kavod, tifaret. Move on to verse 3. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, by the way, is not going to be the actual laborer, the actual individual who is sewing these garments together, but rather, verse 3, Ata tedaber al kol chachmei lev. Now go ahead and speak to the wise-hearted people. Asher miletiv ruach chochma. And by the way, these are not just craftsmen, but rather people that have a divine spirit. Ve'asu et bigdei Aharon, and they should go ahead and make the vestments of Aaron. For what purpose? Lekacho, to sanctify him. Ooh. In other words, gone is the kavod, tifaret, what people see, what people observe, but rather it relates to sanctity, something that's less tangible. Why the switch, we wonder? So this is another question that we're going to have to deal with. The main theme of what's taking place in this week's portion is actually the concept that our Judaism has 2 Torahs, Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh. There's a written law. We have it in the form of these 5 books. And then there's the oral tradition. We have it, originally it was actually transmitted orally, which the oral tradition includes many insights that they date back to Sinai. Many later insights and explanations, and some of them we are so confident that they are the will of God that we call them Halacha Moshe Sinai, even though they are actually later. But it was the will of the Almighty that they should be developed in the future as well. Correct? So we have written law and we have oral tradition. Now, the written law is what we're going to call the law of light. The oral tradition will be hopefully proving that it's really the law of darkness. Why is it the law of darkness? We'll address it very soon. Number 2, the written law, we'll call it the detached law, the concealed law, the law that does not interact, and the oral tradition is the engaged law. Okay? Light, dark, engaged for the oral tradition. Give me something that's the opposite of engaged.
Divorce.
Thank you. More pleasant, perhaps?
The opposite.
Disengaged. Okay. That's what we're going to go ahead, and that's what we're going to address today, and that's what we're going to try with that, with understanding that. I hope we will gain a little bit of clarity of what we're doing here in this week's portion. Now, the Midrash tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu spent 40 days on the top of the mount, right? Comes down hungry, right? But he's a very spiritual man. He's with the Luchot. He comes down, and Nebuch, the first thing he sees, a nation that's worshipping a golden calf. He has no choice. He breaks it, and he has to deal with another 40 days. There's a tradition that he spent 40 days on the top of the mountain. Others note that there were only 2. There are different traditions about it. Clearly, he returns on the 40th on the first day of on the day of Yom Kippur, 10th day of Tishrei. That aside, listen to this midrash. Now listen carefully. The midrash tells us, Moshe lamad Torah bayom. There were days and nights on the top of the mountain. During the day, he learned the Torah from the Almighty. Nighttime, God does not lecture at night. So what was Moshe Rabbeinu doing on the top of the mountain for the 40 nights? Huh? You ever think about it? What? Orla. Ubalayla poshetota beino leben atzmo. He takes the information that he got during the day and he works with it. He clarifies it. He tries to understand it. He develops the law that was revealed to him during the day. He develops it. And that too becomes Torah. And what does that symbolize? What does the nighttime of Moshe Rabbeinu symbolize? Obviously the oral tradition. You know, there are those among the Kabbalists or people that follow that school that they do not study written Torah at night. They have this tradition that they don't read verse. What do they study at? I didn't know. I would treat you differently. Can you give me a bracha? Give me a bracha, my... I don't know in the mirror if they were so careful with that. But in any event, among the Mekubalim, they have that tradition that nighttime is not a time for the written Torah. Nighttime is for the oral tradition, because that's what Moshe Rabbeinu did on the top of the Har Sinai. There's actually a statement that, you know, throughout the years there were 2 Talmuds. Remember, as a kid in Israel, there was a group of kids from America or from out Chutz La'aretz having an argument with Israeli kids. And one of the American kids said, listen, you know, whatever you want to say about us, look at the Babylonian Talmud, which is from Chutz La'aretz, and look at the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is like that, and Babylonian is much bigger, and everyone studies Babylonian Talmud. So obviously, we who are from Chutz La'aretz are smarter than you. That was his insight as he's arguing with his kids in Yerushalayim. The reality is we've been studying Babylonian Talmud far more than Jerusalem Talmud. And when there's a contradiction between the two, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud of exile, trumps the Talmud of Israel. Why is it? So the Talmud itself tells us that the Talmud of Bavli is considered the dark Talmud, right? If you have grandchildren or into Star Wars, it's from the dark side of the Force, in essence. Now, why is it a dark Talmud? What does that mean, a dark Talmud? So comes the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he shares with us the following. Imagine you had a king, and the king wants to play a game. Kings were bored in those days. Today they're trying to hold on to power. In those days they were bored. So he places a key. He takes a key and he conceals it somewhere in his palace. And he designates someone to say, try and find the key. So the individual goes through the palace, comes back 20 minutes later with the key. He says, wonderful, it took you 20 minutes. He takes the same key and he conceals it, but this time he gets one of his slaves to look for it at night. At night. So he starts at 6:30, sunset. It takes him the whole night. 12 hours later he comes back with the key. So the king notes that the individual who searched for the key during the day, perhaps found it in 20 minutes, but the one who searched for it at night really knows the palace well, because he had to go ahead and feel his way to find the key. And he notes that Jerusalem Talmud is a Talmud of clarity. It's in the land of Israel. If you study Jerusalem Talmud, you know that they're not going to have that discussion going back and forth and analyzing it from every angle, but rather they're going to ask a question, find an answer, and move on. In Babylonian Talmud, you could go ahead and spend 3 pages trying to analyze from a different angle and trying to compare it to a different text. Babylonian Talmud is far more detailed because they realize that they're searching in darkness. Searching in darkness, the result is that they are far more familiar with the law and the system of the law. And that's the idea, that the Babylonian Talmud is a Talmud of darkness, but due to the fact that it is constructed in a way that even if you don't have a revelation, you could figure out the wrong from right, therefore the Babylonian Talmud became the one that guides us and is used for the halachic system. This is what we are told. So now, what do we have? Bottom line is that day is a time of revelation. It symbolizes clarity. You will look outside, you could see things from afar. Nighttime is darkness. There is a Torah of darkness as well. And the Torah of darkness is the oral tradition. We have no revelation nowadays. We have not, and if a guy claims he has revelation, right, I ain't listening to him because he's crazy. In other words, we don't have revelation in this day and age, period. What we do have is the tools to figure out things in darkness. And that is what we call oral tradition. Now, with that, there's one of the halachic authorities notes, that judgment, a rabbinic court, so we are told that they could only convene during the day. One of the poskim says that if actually they have many, many candles, they could turn night into day. If you have candles, then they could go ahead and see the parties involved. You can make it into day. And there are those who say that Moshe Rabbeinu, technically speaking, did not have a communication. Whatever form of communication he had, it was a daytime communication. But by lighting the candles, by lighting the nerot in the Ohel Moed throughout the night, it turned night into day, and therefore he was able to experience prophecy and communication with God at night. Because again, the menorah produced light, and it is a light. By the way, the menorah was only lit evening and lasted the whole night. It was a vessel that symbolized nighttime, but it symbolized our ability to create, human ability to create light during the night when it's dark. That is the symbol of oral tradition. And the one to benefit from it at that time, that God could communicate with him at night, when they had the tabernacle standing, was Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore we can understand Tetzaveh ve'ikhu elecha, that it will be for your benefit. So you hear what's happening here. So number one, my approach, the first approach and our first statement was that oral tradition is what is being taught here. Aharon is going to very well will prove it, symbolize oral tradition, but for now, written law is light, oral tradition is dark. And therefore, the lighting of the menorah, which symbolizes oral tradition, and I can tell you that in the temple itself, there's another vessel that symbolizes Torah. And that was, of course, the Holy Ark. It had in it the luchot. The luchot, the handwork of God. That vessel symbolized the written Torah. The Torah, that was from God. On the other hand, the menorah, that will symbolize the Torah that was made by man. Man is supposed to go ahead, just as Moshe Rabbeinu sat there on the top of the mountain at night and clarified issues and used intellect to figure out wrong from right, so too, all of oral tradition has that entity. In yeshivot, there are texts that became like the Bible. In other words, very significant. Every institution has their own holy text that they turn to. I have a book here, a sefer, that's called Ktsot HaChoshen. Ktsot HaChoshen. Now, in yeshivot, it is known as the Ktsot, period. Not the short version. It was written, 1850s, perhaps a touch earlier, perhaps 1840s. And it gained great popularity towards the end of the 19th century. It is written on Choshen Mishpat, the section of Shulchan Aruch that deals with the legal system. It is very analytical, and the author himself tells us something very fascinating. You should know that the yeshiva that gets the credit for making this work very, very popular is actually the Telz Yeshiva. The Telz. I'm a graduate of Telz, not from the Telz where it came from, but rather in the Telz Yeshiva in the 1890s. There was one of the Rabbi was a rabbi by the name of Reb Shimon Shkop, which some of you remember the son, right? The old time, not saying old, but I'm saying the Torontonians. The Torontonians from the past, from a few decades ago. They, right? You learned under Mr. Shkop?
He was a teacher and associate.
A teacher and associate. Even,
I had him.
yeah, wow. So, like...
I'm old.
No. You remember it, too? Also. Everyone. Wow. He was supposedly a very brilliant man. A very brilliant man. Mr. Shkop, they called him. So his father was the superstar of educators. In other words, when in the late 1930s, when he celebrated 50 years as an educator, they put out a book in his honor of Reb Shimon Shkop. He was the superstar. And at a young age, in his 20s, he was giving lectures that were considered the most brilliant in European yeshivot. He started off in the Telz Yeshiva, and he was the one that always pushed for the study of Ktsos. The Ktsos, my grandfather actually learned under Reb Shimon Shkop for some time in a place called Rodna. Nevertheless, in his introduction, the Ksot HaChoshen tells us that you should know that there are people who believe that in our era of darkness, that when we try to figure out Torah, and we know our limitations, so they believe that, listen, we figure out Torah, we do the best of our ability to figure out the truth, and then we settle for whatever truth we reach, even if it's not the real truth. There are those who think that. He writes that that's not true. He writes that the truth of Torah depends on the sechel ha'enoshi. In other words, God proves from a midrash that it is not that there's some kind of truth floating out there in the spiritual realm, and we are supposed to figure out that truth that exists. He says that's not correct. Truth was given to humans. In other words, if we have an halachic question, and an issue that did not exist in the past, what's the status of a microwave? You take a dish, you cook something in it, you have a milchik bowl, you put some fleishik soup, and you put it in the microwave, then you want to know, can you kosher the dish or not? So you have to go ahead and analyze it. Don't expect the microwave to be mentioned in Torah, right? Don't start with a gematria that tells me that the mikrogal is the same gematria. So don't do that for me, right? Don't look in the Talmud. But rather, what you have to do is study what a microwave is about, figure it out. You have to be engaged with the world, by the way. You have to know what it is. After you figure out technically how it works, try to compare it to what existed in the past by analyzing the ovens or the systems of heating that existed in the past. Use what he calls sechel enoshi, human intellect. If you figure it out based on human intellect, that becomes the truth. Okay, now if you have a few rabbis together, and the majority of them think in a specific way, that becomes the truth. So it's not that there's some kind of floating truth. And you know, it's interesting that it is a school that is there to fight those that are concerned, you know, for a chumrah. What I mean is, imagine we have an issue, and the majority of rabbis see it one way, but there's one rabbi who is concerned, and he says, you know what, due to the fact that there's a question mark, I'm going to be strict. Right? Because I want to be sure that I'm not eating something that's not kosher. So what he is arguing is that the kosher and not kosher is determined, the truth is determined by human intellect. Stop with this concern that perhaps in the spiritual realm the reality is different. There's no reality in the spiritual realm. This is oral tradition. This is oral tradition. Oral tradition is decided by humans. It is decided in the darkness. That is Torah Shebe'al Peh. It's in darkness. God wants us to create it. Now, of course, these are people that there's an expectation that they should be very, very familiar with all of tradition, and they should have what they call a glatt kop, the ability to compare A to B. If they have those tools, that becomes the truth. There's a legend that Rabbi Israel Salant, someone asked him one year, can you smoke on Tisha B'Av? Can you smoke on Tisha B'Av? This is before the Surgeon General. Right? And he said, well, I went through the topic and it seems to me not. Next year, they saw him smoking on Tisha B'Av. And asked him, but last year you felt not. He says, well, last year I went through the topic, I analyzed it, it seemed to me something you shouldn't be doing. This year I revisited the topic, and my sechel enoshi seemed to indicate that it's fine, so this year it is fine. Right? It seems like it's some kind of subjective way of thinking, but that's the concept, and that's really what is introduced in this work. It's a work that focuses on using the sechel ha'enoshi. So that's one aspect of Torah, the dark versus the light. That's number one. Number two, and this is crucial here, there is what we're going to call the disengaged and engaged Torah. The holy luchot are in the Holy of Holies. You don't see them, you don't interact with them. Even the high priest, when he enters into the Holy of Holies, he's not going to open and peek into the Holy Ark. It's detached. It is from God, and it stays in its purest form. No one, right, at least we hope, made any adjustments to the Torah the way we have it. The Sofer is very, very careful. The times don't change, right? The fonts, the times do not change, right? The structure of the written Torah. That is disengaged. Oral tradition, on the other hand, oral tradition is actually engaged. It is actually engaged. Now, what do I mean by that? Right? That teachings of the oral tradition are engaged laws. I'll give you a perfect example. Last week we had a class about Shemitah. Right? We talked about, is it online already?
Yeah.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Now, we talked about the exodus of Rabbeinu Asher. There's a rabbi, the greatest rabbinic authority in Germany, towards the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. His master was thrown into jail. He's persecuted. He has to escape Germany. Believe it or not, there was anti-Semitism once in Germany. And he makes his way to Spain. He arrives in Spain, and he has to learn about a new culture. Among the issues he dealt with had to do with tzitzit that are made out of linen. Meaning, there was an old Ashkenazi tradition based on a Rabbeinu Tam who read a section in the Talmud in a specific way, that a garment, if you have clothes that are made out of linen, right, you should not make tzitzit out of them, for whatever technical reason. And that became the given tradition. Rabbeinu Tam says it in, let's say, around 1150. So 150 years later, this became the given law. Like, no one would dare in Ashkenaz have the chutzpah of having tzitzit made out of, that the garment is linen. He arrives in Spain, and guess what everyone's wearing in Spain?
Linen.
Tzitzit made out of linen. So he writes that, listen, I have a problem with it based on this Ashkenazi tradition, but on the other hand, if I get up and declare that there is a problem with it, no one's going to wear tzitzit. I can't do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to revisit this Ashkenazi tradition, reread the section of the Talmud that for 150 years they've been drilling them in Germany that it's a problem, and he was able to reread it in a way where it's actually permissible. You realize that he goes ahead and he changes a given law. That's what the oral tradition is about. You sense what's occurring in the world, you are engaged with the world, you read what's happening, and you establish things, just as the Prusbul, to go ahead and deal with the issue of loans and Shemitah, just like there's a prohibition of charging interest. What happens when Jews enter into banking? Jews, money, you've heard of that? Mm-hmm. So what do? How do you take care of it? Heteriska, right? Like, in other words, you know what's happening in the world. My father shared an interesting story that when he arrived in Mexico in 1976, one of the big problems was the fact that they were shechting young calves. I once gave a talk about it, that according to halacha, you're not supposed to shecht a calf until the 8th day from its birth, to be sure that it's a healthy animal. But in Mexico, it seemed to be very, the meat was very popular to shecht younger calves. And it was a halachic issue that he had to deal with. It was a major, there were tshuvas about it. I talked about the fact that when in Mexico in 1979 they sent a question to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, they got a tshuva that it's okay, but they fooled him. In other words, they didn't share all the information, which is a good way if you ever want to get a heter. Just don't give all the information, and you'll get what you want, just on the side. Now, So my father struggled with the issue. He struggled with the issue. And I found in his writings after his passing a letter he wrote in 1977 to his Rosh Hashiva in Baltimore, to Rabbi Ruderman, like, how do I deal with it? Right? And I know that, it was an issue that was on his head. In the summer of 1979, my father's in Israel, right? So he's already been in the position close to 3 years. He's still struggling with it. And he went to a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yosef Shalom Rabbi Elyashiv, who was a posek, a well-respected posek. And he goes to Rabbi Elyashiv, he shares with him the question, and Rabbi Elyashiv says to him immediately, it's prohibited, it's a problem. So my father says to him, but okay, if the rabbi says it's a problem, fine, but you should know that if you say it's a problem, I'm going to have to just leave my job and quit. He says, oh, wait a second, it has to do with Parnasa, so give me a day to look into it. In other words, his whole approach, when he heard that it's a livelihood, now let me try to find now if there's perhaps some kind of way out. Perhaps there's a leniency we can find. So he comes back the next day, and he said, it's prohibited. Okay? He didn't, no leniency. But my father's story is that when he heard, he felt this is already a different level of responsibility. I have to go ahead and research it much, much more. Right? There's an engagement because, now, engagement does not mean that you can make everything kosher. Engagement means that you approach it and sense that there is a world. You use common sense, right? You go ahead and you make too many prohibitions, people are going to violate the laws. You go ahead and say that which is really prohibited, permissible, you go ahead and destroy Judaism. There's, of course, a sensitivity and guidelines how to do it. There's an engaged element to Judaism. And if you look at Moshe Rabbeinu,
What's the end of the story with your dad?
We left Mexico. These events are occurring in the summer of 1979. We leave Mexico in February 1980.
Why do they still chef chicken?
Okay, that after yes.
Why can't we do the same thing with Gittin?
With what?
Ooh, loaded questions here. What you mean with Aguna question?
Aguna question.
Oh, boy. See, the real questions are being asked now. Very, very, very complex. There's no question. There is a problem, and there's no question that this has to be addressed.
I hate it.
Bottom line is...
Men who were affected, it would have been done already.
What was that?
If the men had been affected, it would have been done already.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You had a math degree for this.
Anyway, no, we're fine with this.
He's fixed it.
No, she's not blaming me. Right?
I just want you to do something about it.
I know my place as well. In other words, let me just mention one thing. I have no doubt that if God would have given me the brilliance that others have, in other words, if I would have been up there as one of the leaders of this generation, I would have put time and effort and energy into it. No question in my mind. The reality is that I know my place. In other words, I want to see just as much as you do, believe me, I want to see. But I'm not the person. I know it. I know. I mean, I know people.
I really wasn't.
I know. I'm just mentioning straight out. I'm using the platform to mention the fact that I'm not a leader of this generation. It's a fact. I mean, I recognize that, there's some things I know, there are things I don't know, and I also know that there are people that are light years ahead of me in their understanding, in their brilliance, and, hopefully in their commitment as well. So I also agree that it is something that the leaders, the halachic leaders, should address it. And this is something that I'm not the first to say it. When Rabbi Weinberg, the great Sri Daesh, was asked this question, he also agreed that something should be done. So everyone agrees. What is already more complex? With that, let's talk about engaged and disengaged Judaism. Moshe Rabbeinu is a symbol of the... What kind of Judaism would you picture Moshe Rabbeinu? Top of the mountain, right? Disengaged. He's not the communicator. Who is the one that is...
Aaron.
Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom. Now, if you look later in our history, and you look at the two schools, what two schools am I referring to that you find in one of those schools? That Aaron approach, of course, Hillel, the one we follow. Hillel. And Hillel is the one of Ohev Talmidav, be from the disciples of Aaron. Be engaged, sense what people need. That's what the system is about. My father used to say that when Moshe says, listen, I can't communicate with Pharaoh. I'm not the communicator, a few weeks ago. So Moshe Rabbeinu was told by God that you have a brother called Aharon, and hu yeh lecha lepeh. He shall be your mouthpiece. And if you look at the first letters of those words, hu, meaning he, Aaron, yeh lecha lepeh, it spells Hillel. That's the idea, that he is like the Hillel. He is the communicator. And that's really what is taking place in this week's portion. We are introducing the man that symbolizes the menorah, the engaged personality, that there's clarity that he gets from the Torah. Now with that, what we understand very well is that the vestments of the high priest are there for kavod and tifaret, meaning he's supposed to inspire people. You see him, you go, wow, look at the glory. My goodness, look at the splendor of these vestments. They are impressed by him. They feel an attachment to him. You know that when the high priest would die, it was considered the most devastating day for the nation. A day of mourning, right? A day that, you release people from cities of refuge because there's just a depression that falls the nation. This is the high priest. He's engaged. He is concerned. He symbolizes the oral tradition, the engaged part of Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, is the Torah shebichtav. There is absolutely no adjustment to the written Torah. So now, when God tells him to make those vestments are, of course, for glory and splendor. But after, you should know that with his engagement and with his interaction, when he comes up with law, that itself is also holy. Don't think that because he comes up with law, and don't think that because the Rosh said, Rabbeinu Asher said in Spain, that you could be lenient, don't think that that is no longer holy. That statement is holy as well. That too is, look in the next verse, lekacho. Right? That is the idea, lekacho. There's actually a letter that they found, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach wrote to an Australian community about what a rabbi is about. And he notes that chutz mema sheharav tzarich lehachshir et atzmo letshuvot. In other words, historically, what was a rabbi doing? What do rabbis do the whole day? Everybody wonders that, right? What? So historically, he would answer tshuvot. People would come with questions, and the rabbi has to study, right? He has to study, even if it's an issue that there's not going to be a question today about it, but the rabbi should be familiar with Jewish law, that even the questions of tomorrow could be addressed. So he writes that historically the rabbi was involved with tshuvot. But today, in these times, a rabbi has to be engaged with people. Tzarich le'orer et kahal hadato l'she'elot. He has to be engaged to awaken them to ask questions. It's not enough for a rabbi to just say, I'll study, right? I'll be like Moshe Rabbeinu, sit there on the top of the mountain, study, and I'll answer if someone asks questions. He says, no. Times have changed. You have to be engaged to inspire people that they ask she'elot as well. That's what we have. Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned in this week's Parsha. This is a Parsha that is really introducing the concept of oral tradition when the light, when revelation is concealed. And the way we deal with it is with being engaged, recognizing, being sensitive, knowing the parameters, knowing the guidelines, and we must always be mindful of that there are guidelines of what becomes prohibited and what becomes permissible, but we are a very engaged faith. And that is what is achieved by the Ohev Shalom Verodev Shalom. That is what is achieved by Aharon HaKohen, by loving people, right, and being concerned for them. You know, people like Rav Kook, who always used to preach that if we're going to go ahead and come up with these highest standards, like in the 1909 sesame oil controversy, I talked about it here, that in 1909 they produced sesame oil for Pesach in Yafo. And Rav Kook gives his hashgacha, and the Kanaim, right, the zealots of the old Yishuv were very upset. And he said that if you guys are going to put these extremely high standards, right, you're going to distance people from Judaism. The responsibility of the rabbi is to know what's happening, and wherever possible, to come up with a leniency. Wherever possible, it got to be possible. That was leadership. He was a Kohen, by the way, Rav Kook. Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom, being engaged. And that is the core, and that is the essence of oral tradition. Thank you for listening, and everyone have yourself a wonderful day.